Yeah, it is through the language that we come to learn the real birth of Atlantis, and thereby everything that is associated with it, a figment of Plato's very creative and active imagination, which has gone on to inspire more stories and voyages and movies since then. So I mentioned this to my husband, and he said, some people don't believe that there was ever an Atlantis. But if you consider that at one point in the history of Earth, all the continents were one big mass, then through the course of time, the masses separated. That is the recorded science of it. So it could be possible that a portion of land mass where Atlantic is currently located could have jutted as an island out in the Atlantic before it completely disappeared. Hence, the lost Atlantis may not be a myth after all. So then, for my amusement, and perhaps yours, I looked up the supercontinent, which, by the way, I've left the links to my research in the description of this video. And according to the United States Geological Survey, from about 300 to 200 million years ago, late Paleozoic era until the very late Triassic, the continent we now know as North America was contiguous with Africa, South America, and Europe. That supercontinent was known as Pangea, and it began breaking apart around 200 million years ago during the early Jurassic period due to the movement of the tectonic plates of the Earth, eventually forming the 7 separate continents we know today. Now, many of us go on our everyday lives and not think about islands or land masses disappearing. Yet it happens. I ran into an article on NBC News mentioning the disappearance of a couple of islands. Shockingly, within the last decade. One was Tebuinaku on the Central Pacific island nation of Kiribati. You know, I actually have edited this little piece several times. I have a Florida crane standing out my window, so I guess he wants to join in on the video, so I'll leave it here for effect. Okay. I was mentioning the Tebuinaku on the Central Pacific island nation of Kiribati. It was said to be a thriving village. They say that occasionally when the tide is just right, one can see the rooftop of the last standing church out in the middle of the water. Another article wrote that an entire Hawaiian island has vanished under the waves in the wake of Hurricane Walaka. Who knows what myths people will tell about us in the future? Surely there is much to say about sending people on flying machines and hearing voices of the dead coming out from unknown listening devices. Yes, Elvis lives on. And who knows what else they may say about us as we continue to embrace new technology. So what say you? Could Atlantis have been real? Leave me your comments. Welcome. I am Daisy, your hostess. What you finished listening to was a clip from another video here in my channel titled The Emerald Tablet of Thoth, the Atlantean. Make sure to check it out later. It was in fact the inspiration to learn more about the origins of Atlantis. Clearly, archaeology is not the only way to uncover past cultures. Linguists who explore the study of language through the analysis of written words, inscriptions, and literature, literally speaking, are like word archaeologists, allowing us to access knowledge from the people who created them and how they interacted with the world around them, their migrations, trade, and more. In this video, we will look into Plato's Critias, which was translated from the Greek by A.E. Taylor. We are invited to a made-up conversation between Timaeus, Critias, Socrates, and Hermocrates. It appears to be a continuation for the dialogue of Plato's Timaeus, and the discourse by Timaeus could have been a far-off continuation of Plato's Republic, making that whole thing like a trilogy, but that is a speculation. Please make sure to check out my playlist for Plato's Timaeus. Now, the question that I pose, is Atlantis real? Or is it really, as history revealed through the very own words of Plato, a figment of his imagination? Given that it is the first time ever that the word Atlantis appeared in written history, in the works of Plato, Timaeus, and Critias, And he even states himself that it is fiction. If so, it is not the first time that a writer's imagined story has taken legs to provide sequels, and in so doing, bringing to life things that were not. Ah, look, we magically ended up here in the Temple of Apollo on Mount Parnassus in ancient Greece. What a lovely view for a fantastic discourse. Introduction to the Critias. Little needs to be said by way of introduction to the fragment Critias. It purports to contain the full narrative promised at Plato's Timaeus section 26 of the ancient world war in which Athens had been the protagonist on one side, the confederacy of the 10 Atlantic kings on the other. In fact, however, the actual contents cover only preliminary sketch of the geographical, economic, and moral situation on both sides. The manuscript breaking off in the middle of a sentence just as the actual story is on the point of beginning. There's no reason to suppose that Plato ever carried the work further. The singular grammatical difficulties of the fragment, some of which have been mentioned in the notes to the present version, are not of a kind to be readily explained by transcriptional corruption. They point rather to the view that we have before us is an unfinished concept, or rough sketch never put into final form by its author, and most probably circulated without editorial revision after his death. Since there is no reasonable doubt that Timaeus and Critias are among the productions of an old age prolonged to over 80, we may account for Plato's failure to finish his story in more than one way. He may conceivably have turned away from it because he found his interest flagging, or his powers failing, or because he was anxious to devote his last years to the completion of the laws, or he may actually have meant to the last to complete the work sooner or later, and death may have prevented him. In any case, since the language of Timaeus, with all its difficulties, exhibits every sign of careful revision for circulation, I think we may safely infer that the Critias was probably separated from the Timaeus by an interval of at least some years, just as the Timaeus itself was separated by a longer interval from the Republic to which it is made to appear a sequel. This may account for the presence of what looks like a curious discrepancy between the two. The famous passage, Timaeus, of the former dialogue dealing with the position of the earth in the universe is only intelligible if we take it to mean that the earth executes some kind of rectilinear excursions about the center of the world, which must therefore be assumed to be unoccupied. But at the end of the fragment of the Critias, Zeus is described as calling a general sign out of the gods in his most honorable residence, which is said to be situated at the middle of the world. It is impossible to see here an allusion to the doctrine of those Pythagoreans who thought the doctrine of a central fire or luminary, which, as we know, was called among other things the house and the watchtower of Zeus, Critias. Then, unlike Timaeus, apparently agrees with what we know from Theophrastus to have been the final conviction of Plato himself, that the center of the universe is neither empty nor filled by the earth, but occupied by a worthier body. The discrepancy might be intentional, since there is no reason why Timaeus and Critias should be represented as wholly agreed on such matters, but it is more natural to account for it as involuntary and due to the lapse of an interval between the composition of the two works. There is also one other less striking discrepancy of the same kind which points to the same conclusion. The statement of Critias that he had already mentioned the boundaries of prehistoric Attica. Nothing is actually said on the matter in the Timaeus. It is not necessary to say much about the sources of the account given of the institutions of Attica or Atlantis. There's no reason to suppose that Plato had anything to draw upon except his own fertile imagination. It is made fairly clear all through that the reconstruction of the geological and economic conditions of Attica is based on intelligent induction from closely observed facts of the existing situation. The main interest of the narrative is that it, more than anything else in the dialogues, reveals a side of Plato's genius, which is often forgotten. It shows him as a singularly acute observer of the details of a natural processes and a sober interpreter of his observations. His account of the geological peculiarities of the Attica of his own day and their economic consequences is excellent. The interpretation given to the facts suggests two criticisms: that he tends to ascribe to catastrophic convulsions of nature consequences which a modern inquirer would be more likely to explain by the continuous operation of less sensational agencies through a vast period of time, and that, as Emervald has said, some of the effects traced to natural agencies, for instance, the destruction of primitive forests, are really due in the main by human recklessness. It is more important to observe that the Critias gives even less reason than the Timaeus to look for any traditional historical information as the source of the account of Atlantis. In the Critias, we actually hear of papers of Solon, represented as heirlooms in the family of Critias, that is, in Plato's own family, as the authority for the details of the story. We could not be told much more plainly that the whole story of Solon's conversation with the Egyptian priests and the account of the lost island which he learned from them is a pure fiction. It is just because it is fiction and intended to be read as fiction that Plato amuses himself with a pretended documentation by manuscripts of which no one outside his own family has heard. The imaginary old manuscript has been used in the same way with great effect by a whole tribe of modern romance writers from Horace Walpole to our own contemporaries, and it is interesting to find that Plato had anticipated the device. Of course, his imagination must have had something to work on, and Dr. P. Friedlander is fully justified in his suggestion that the account of the regular mathematical form of the Atlantic city and the plain in which it stood, and the description of the gigantic irrigation system of the mythical kings owe much of their inspiration to accounts of Babylon. I venture also to think that Plato got a hint for what he has to say of the great naval works of Atlantis from his own personal observation of the transformations effected at Syracuse by Dionysius I. The basis of the account of the moral of the two opposing parties in the World War is equally obvious, given the assumption that Attica was once a much more fertile and populous district than it is at present, and had a flourishing history for centuries. The conclusion is natural that the moral and political institutions of the inhabitants were remarkably sound. When this thesis is combined with one which all the parties to the conversations are agreed, that the foundations of a sound public and private moral are the principles advocated by Socrates in the Republic, it follows at once that the life of the prehistoric Athenians must have been much what Critias asserts. The account of the institutions of Atlantis admits of an equally simple explanation. The moral of the story is to be that a morally sound public and private life will secure a nation against the greatest superiority in numbers and technical science on part of its adversary. To make the point, the Atlantic Confederacy must be described as equipped with all the advantages of vast numbers, immense material wealth, and marvelous technical skill, but inferior in morality, and particularly in voluntary devotion to free institutions. With all their high material civilization, they must be infected by the poison of what we today loosely call Orientalism, must be the hordes of a sultan. This necessary flavor of Orientalism is secured by a host of adroit touches. The kings have, apart from an exception in favor of members of their own families, an arbitrary power over life and death, and are surrounded by a great army of personal bodyguards. The basis of the military organization is the unhellenic war chariot. Even the great temple of Poseidon has something not Hellenic in its character, and there is probably a touch of irony in the account of the colossal size of God's statue. Plato dwells on the size and splendor of this temple and its adornments, but we may note that he does not commend their beauty by a single word. If, as is probable, he had seen works of this kind for himself in Egypt, we may conjecture that his verdict was that they were more impressive than really beautiful. It is a little singular that the popular imagination, which has been fascinated by this tale of Atlantis, has always overlooked its central point. These Oriental invaders were splendid barbarians, but barbarians at heart in spite of their splendor, and moreover, the time of their greatest external splendor was the very period at which their innate barbarism had at last got the upper hand over what was best in them. Their great bid for Wehrmacht was only a visible symptom of Niedergang. How the story was to have been continued we do not know. We are told that Zeus was preparing a severe reverse for the haughty and self-confident nation, that they might be brought back to tune by the discipline. We know that the end of the tale was to be their complete annihilation. It is not obvious how the two points of view were to be brought together. Were the Atlantis to harden their hearts like Pharaoh and thus prove themselves incurables? I should conjecture, from the prominence given to Poseidon in the fragment, that this god, in any case, had a part to play in the story. Did the kings end by estranging even their own Theos Patron? And was the wrath of Poseidon a familiar motive in the Odyssey to bring about the great deluge and earthquake? We can ask such questions, but have no means of answering them. The discourse is apparently feigned to be delivered on the day after that of Timaeus. We might indeed suppose it to be uttered later on the same day, since 3 such dialogues as the Timaeus would be together shorter than the Republic, and we must suppose this if the words of about what was said yesterday be taken as an allusion to the Republic. They may, however, equally well refer directly to the recapitulation of the regulations of the Republic, with which the Timaeus opens, and seem intended actually to recall Timaeus. If the two discourses are meant to belong to one day, are we to assume that there has been an interval for luncheon? End of translator's introduction. Plato's Critias. The characters involved: Timaeus, Critias, Socrates, Hermocrates. Timaeus. Well, Socrates, at last I am barely in port after my voyage on the seas of discourse, and with what a sense of relief. I feel like some traveler at the end of a weary journey. So I make it my prayer to the God who has been born but now in our tale, though so long ago in fact, that he will of his grace vouchsafe as retention of what has been spoken to purpose, and visit us with the proper penalty for any false note we have unwittingly struck in our treatment of these matters. Now the right penalty is that he who strays from tune should be brought back to it, to the end, then, that our discourses of the making of gods may be rightly uttered hereafter. I call on him to grant us that surest and best of medicines, knowledge, and with this prayer I hand over the further continuance of the tale to Critias, as we agreed I should do. Critias. Aye, Timaeus, and I accept the task, but I, too, must once more make the same request you yourself advanced before me. I must crave indulgence on the score of the magnitude of the subject, and I think I have an even better claim than yourself to a still further measure of consideration for what yet remains to be told. To be sure, I am well aware that my request will seem vastly presumptuous and unduly tactless, yet made it must be. What man in his sound senses, indeed, could venture to dispute the excellence of your exposition? What I must try to show, as I can, is that the theme still to be expounded is more difficult to handle, and consequently calls for yet more generous allowances. In fact, Timaeus, upon an audience of human beings, it is easier to produce the impression of adequate treatment in speaking of gods than in discoursing of mortals like ourselves. The combination of unfamiliarity and sheer ignorance in an audience makes the task of one who is to treat a subject towards which they are in this state easy in the extreme, and in this matter of gods, we know, of course, how the case stands with us. But to make my meaning still clearer, kindly follow an illustration. All statements made by any of us are, of course, bound to be an affair of imagery and picturing. Now, suppose we consider the ease or difficulty with which an artist's portrait of figures, divine and human respectively, produces the impression of satisfactory reproduction on the spectator. We shall observe that in the case of earth, mountains, rivers, woodland, the sky as a whole, and the several revolving bodies located in it, for one thing, the artist is always well content if he can reproduce them with some faint degree of resemblance, and for another, that since our knowledge of such subject is never exact, we submit his design to no criticism or scrutiny, but acquiesce in these cases in a dim and deceptive outline. But when it is our own human form that the artist undertakes to depict, daily familiar observation makes us quick to detect shortcomings, and we show ourselves severe critics of one who does not present us with full and perfect resemblance. Well, we should recognize that the same is true of discourses. Where the subjects of them are celestial and divine, we are satisfied by mere faint verisimilitudes. Where mortal and human, we are exacting critics. So with our present unrehearsed narrative, if we do not succeed in reproducing the proper touches perfectly, allowances should be made. In fact, we ought to understand that to depict human life impressively is hard, not easy. It is to remind you of all this, Socrates, and to plead for a greater, not a lesser measure of indulgence for what I am now to relate, that I have made this long speech. If you all feel that my appeal for this favor is justified, pray grant it with demur. Socrates. To be sure we will, Critias. What is more, the same favor may be taken as granted by anticipation to Hermocrates after you. For I see plainly enough that by and by, when it comes to his turn to speak, he will make the same request as his precursors. As I would have him cast about for a fresh exordium, and not be driven to repeat the old one, he may make his speech with the assurance that consideration is guaranteed him when the time comes. Still, I would warn you, my dear Critias, of the temper of your auditory. The composer who preceded you made a wonderfully favorable impression, and you will need the most generous indulgence if you are to prove equal to succeeding him. Hermocrates. That, Socrates, is a warning as much to me as to our friend. Still, Critias, faint heart never yet set up trophy, so you must launch out into your narrative like a man, calling Paeon and the Muses to aid you in displaying and lauding the worth of your fellow Athenians of ancient days. Critias. Ah, my dear Hermocrates, your post is in the rear rank, under cover of another. That is why your spirits are still undashed. Well, you may very possibly discover what the situation is like for yourself in the course of events. Meanwhile, I must, at any rate, follow your encouraging advice and invoke the gods at large, including those you have mentioned, but of all, memory. She is the power on whom the whole fortune of my discourse most depends. If I can only sufficiently recall and repeat the story as it was once told by the priests and brought home to this country by Solon, I am confident that my present audience will pronounce me to have discharged my task with reasonable credit. Well, I must proceed to the story itself at once without further delay. In the very first place, let us remind ourselves that it is in all 9,000 years since a general war, of which we are now to relate the course, was declared between those who dwelt without and those who dwelt within the pillars of Heracles. The command of the latter was taken, and the war conducted throughout, as the story ran, by our own city. The leaders of the other party were the kings of the island of Atlantis. Atlantis, as you will recollect, was once said an island larger than Libya and Asia together, It has now been engulfed by earthquakes and is the source of the impassable mud which prevents navigators from this quarter from advancing through the straits into the open ocean. As for the mass of the barbarian peoples and the Hellenic communities of those days, the various details will become plain on occasion as the course of the narrative unfolds. But we shall have to begin with a preliminary review of the respective resources and polities of the Athenians of the time and the antagonists against whom the war was waged, and of the two parties we must give the precedence to our own countrymen. Of old, then, the gods distributed the whole earth by regions, and that without contention. That gods know not their several dues, or if they know them, yet some seek by contention to engross to themselves what more properly belongs to others. These are perverse imaginations. They apportioned to each his own by righteous allotment, settled their territories, and, when they had settled them, fell to feeding us, their bestial and flocks there, as herdsmen do their cattle. Only they would not coerce body with body in the fashion of shepherds who drive their flocks to pasture with blows. They set the course of the living creature from that part about which it turns most readily, its prow, controlling its soul after their own mind by persuasion, as by a rudder, and so moving and steering the whole mortal fabric. Thus divers gods received divers districts as their portions and reigned over them. But Hephaestus and Athena, as they had one nature, being brother and sister by the same father, and at one, moreover, in their love of wisdom and artistry, so also obtained one lot in common, this our land, to be a home meet for prowess and understanding. They produced from the soul a race of good men and taught them the order of their polity. Their names have been preserved, but their deeds forgotten by reason of the destructions of their successors and the lapse of time. For the remnant of survivors, as has indeed been already said, was ever left unlettered among its mountains, and had heard no more than the names of the country's rulers and a few of their deeds. So they were all pleased to give the names to their sons, but as for the virtues and laws of older generations, they knew nothing of them beyond some dim reports, but were, for many generations, themselves and their children, in want of bare necessaries. So they gave their minds to their own needs and made their discourses of them, forgetting the story of far away early days. For legendary lore and inquiry into ancient things both visit cities in the train of leisure, when they see men already provided with the necessaries of life, and not before. Thus it has come about that the names of the ancients have been preserved without any memorial of their deeds. My warrant for what I say is this: Cecrops, Erytheus, Erythanus, Erysichthon, and most of the recorded names for Theseus are in the main the very names given, as Solon said, by the priest in their tale of that distant war, as are also the names of the women, and in special the figure and image of the goddess, whom they of old set up in the armor according to the custom of their time, when exercises of war were common to women and men alike, signifies that in all living creatures that company together female with male, nature ever grants it to both to practice the excellence proper to their kind. Now, at that time, most sorts of citizens who dwelt in this land were busied with handicrafts and tillage of the soil, but the fighting sort had been set apart at the first by godlike men, and dwelt by themselves, furnished with all that was proper for their sustenance and training. None of them had any private possession of his own. They looked on all things as the common store of all, seeking to receive from their fellow citizens nothing beyond sufficient sustenance. In short, they followed all the practices we spoke of yesterday when we talked of these feigned guardians. In particular, there is truth and credibility in what we said of the territory. As first, that its boundaries were then drawn at the isthmus and on the side of the mainland at the summits Cytherion and Parnes, and its borders came down to the sea with Oropus on the right, and the Aesopus shut out on the left. Again, that the soul far surpassed all others, which indeed is why the district could then maintain a great army exempt from all task of husbandry. And here is good evidence of its excellence. The remnant now left of it is a match for any soul in the world in the variety and quality of its harvests and the pasturage it yields to all sorts of cattle. But of old its yield was most copious as well as excellent. What proof is there of this? And why are we right to call it a remnant of the land of those days? It is one long projection running out from the main body of the continent into the open sea, like a headland, and as we know, the marine basin that borders it is extremely deep. So, while there have been many formidable deluges in the course of the 9,000 years, that is the interval between the date we are speaking of and the present. The soil washed away from the higher levels in these periodical convulsions does not deposit any notable sediment as in some other regions, but is regularly carried off and lost in the depths. Consequently, that has happened which happens in little islets. By comparison with the original territory, what is left now is, so to say, the skeleton of a body wasted by disease. The rich, soft soil has been carried off, and only the bare framework of the district left. At the time we are speaking of, these ravages had not begun. Our present mountains were high crest. What we now call the plains of Peleus were covered with rich soil, and there was abundant timber on the mountains, of which traces may still be seen. For some of our mountains at present will only support trees, but not so very long ago trees fit for the roofs of vast buildings were felled there, and the rafters are still in existence. There were also many other lofty cultivated trees, which provided unlimited fodder for beasts. Besides, the soil got the benefit of the yearly water from Zeus, which was not lost, as it is today, by running off a barren ground to the sea. A plentiful supply of it was received into the soil and stored up in the layers of non-porous potter's clay. Thus, the moisture absorbed in the higher regions percolated to the hollows, and so all quarters were lavishly provided with springs and rivers. Even to this day, the sanctuaries of their former sources survive to prove the truth of our present account of the country. This, then, was the natural condition of the district at large, and it had received cultivation such as might be expected from true husbandmen with no other vocation, who were also lovers of all that is noble and men of admirable natural parts, possessed of an excellent soil, a generous water supply, and an eminently temperate climate. As for the town, its plan at that time was as follows. To begin with, the Acropolis was not then as it is now. At present, it has been washed bare of soil by one night of extraordinary floods, in which an earthquake and the third terrible deluge before that of Diocletian befell together. But in another and earlier days, it was so large that it reached to the Eridanus and Issus, enclosing the Pnyx, and bounded on the side facing it by the Lycabettus. The whole was covered with soil, and save here and there, the surface was level. Without, directly under its slopes, were the dwellings of the craftsmen and the husbandmen who tilled the adjoining fields. Higher up, the fighting force had its abode by itself round the temple of Athena and Hephaestus, girdled by a single wall, like the garden of one house. On the northern side they had fashioned their common dwelling houses and winter mess rooms, with all that was proper for their mode of life in common in the way of buildings for themselves and temples, but no gold nor silver, for they made no use of these metals for any purpose. They aimed at the mean between splendor and meanness, dwelling in decent houses where they grew old, themselves and their children's children, each succeeding generation leaving them to another like itself. Today only shrunken hills remain in the vicinity. Then it provided all with an abundant supply of water, equally wholesome in winter and summer. Such was their manner of life, then. They were at once guardians of their fellow citizens and freely followed leaders of the Hellenes at large. The number of both sexes already qualified and still qualified to bear arms, they were careful to keep, as nearly as possible, always the same, roughly some 20,000. With such personalities and such a standing method of administering Hellas and their own commonwealth in righteousness, they were famous throughout Europe and Asia alike for the comeliness of their persons and for every virtue of the soul, and had the greatest name of the time. As for the condition and early history of their antagonists, if my memories of the tale I heard as a boy do not play me false, I will now impart the story freely to you as friends. But before I begin my narrative, I must make a brief explanation, or you may be surprised to hear of so many barbarians with Hellenic names. So I will give you the reason for this. Solon had a fancy to turn the tale to account in his own poetry. So he asked questions about the significance of the names and discovered that the original Egyptian authors of the narrative had translated them into their own speech. In his turn, as he learned the sense of a name, he translated it back again, in his manuscript, into our own language. His actual papers were once in my father's hands and are in my own to this day, and I studied them thoroughly in my boyhood. So if you hear names like those of our own countrymen, you must not be surprised. I have given you the explanation. Well, then, the story, and a long story it is, began much in this fashion. As we said before, when we were speaking of the lots, the gods divided the whole earth into lots, some larger, some smaller, and established their temples and sacrifices in them. Poseidon then, thus receiving as his lot the Isle of Atlantis, settled his sons by a mortal woman in a district at which must now be described. By the sea, in the center of the island, there was a plain, said to have been the most beauteous of all such plains and very fertile, and again, near the center of this plain, at a distance at some 50 furlongs, a mountain which was nowhere at any great altitude. In this mountain lived one of the original earthborn men of that region, named Eunor, with his wife Leucippe. The pair had an only daughter, Cleito, who was just husband high when her mother and father both died. Poseidon desired this damsel, had to do with her, and fortified the hill where she had her abode by a fence of alternate rings of sea and land, smaller and greater, one within another. He fashioned 2 such round wheels, as we may call them, of earth and 3 of sea from the very center of the island, at uniform distances, thus making the spot inaccessible to man, for there were as yet no ships and no seafaring. The island left at their center he adorned with his own hand, a light enough to task for a god, causing 2 fountains to flow from underground springs, one warm, the other cold, and the soil to send up abundance of food plants of all kinds. He then begat 5 twin births of male offspring and divided the whole Isle of Atlantis into 10 parts. On the earliest born of the first pair, he bestowed their mother's dwelling place with the lot of land surrounding it, the best and largest of all, and appointed him king over his brethren. The rest he made princes, granting each of them the sovereignty over a large population and the lordship of wide lands. Further, he gave names to them all. Their king, the eldest, received a name from which the ocean, as well as the whole island, got its designation. It is called Atlantic, because the name of the first king of old times was Atlas. His younger twin brother, to whose share fell the extremity of the island off the Pillars of Heracles, fronting the region now known as Gadira, from the name of his territory, was called in Greek Eumelus, but in the language of his own country Gadarus, and no doubt his name was the origin of that district. One of the second pair was called Amphires, the other Eumon, the elder of the third Neusis, and his junior Autochthon. The elder of the fourth, Elasippus, the younger Mestor, Azaeus was the name of the elder of the fifth pair, that of his brother Diaprepes. All these and their descendants for many generations reigned as princesses of numerous islands of the ocean besides their own, and were also, as has been already said, suzerains of the population of the hither or inner side of the straits, as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia. Now from Atlas sprang a prolific and illustrious house which retained the throne for many generations. the eldest being always king and transmitting the succession to his eldest descendant. They possessed wealth such as had never been amassed by any royal line before them and could not be easily matched by any after, and were equipped with all resources required for their city and dominions at large. Though their empire brought them a great external revenue, it was the island itself which furnished the main provision for all purposes of life. In the first place, it yielded all products of the miner's industry, solid and fusible alike, including one of which is now only a name but was then something more, Archaeological, which was excavated in various parts of the island, and had then a higher value than any metal except gold. It also bore in its forests a generous supply of all timbers serviceable to the carpenter and builder, and maintained a sufficiency of animals, wild and domesticated. Even elephants were plentiful. There was ample pasture for this, the largest and most voracious of brutes, no less than for all the other creatures of marsh, lake and river, mountain and plain. Besides all this, the soil bore all aromatic substances still to be found on earth, roots, stalks, canes, gums exuded by flowers and fruits, and they throve on it. Then, as for cultivated fruits, the dry sort which is meant to be our food supply, and those others we use as solid nutriment, we call the various kinds pulse, as well as the woodland kind which gives us meat and drink and oil together. The fruit of trees that ministers to our pleasure and merriment and is so hard to preserve, and that we serve a welcome dessert to a jaded man to charm away his satiety. All these were produced by that sacred island, which then they lay upon to the sun in marvelous beauty and inexhaustible profusion. So the kings employed all these gifts of the soil to construct and beautify their temples, royal residences, harbors, docks, and domain in general on the following plan. They first bridged the rings of sea around their original home, thus making themselves a road from and to their palace. This palace they originally built at the outset in the dwelling place of the god and their ancestors, and each monarch, as he inherited it in his turn, added beauties to its existing beauties, always doing his utmost to surpass his predecessor, until they had made the residences a marvel for the size and splendor of its buildings. They began on the seaside by cutting a canal to the outermost ring, 50 furlongs long, 300 feet broad, and 100 feet deep. The ring could now be entered from the sea by this canal like a port, as the opening they had made would admit the largest of vessels. Further, at these bridges they made openings in the rings of land which separated those of water just sufficient to admit the passage of a single trireme, and covered the openings in so that the voyage through them became subterranean, for the banks of the rings of the earth were considerably elevated above the sea level. The breadth of the largest ring of water, that to which the canal from the sea had been made, was 3 furlongs and a half, and that of the contiguous ring of land the same. Of the second pair, the ring of water had a breadth of 2 furlongs, and that of land was once more equal in breadth to the water outside it. The land which immediately surrounded the central islet was in breadth 1 furlong. The islet on which the palace stood had a diameter of 5 furlongs. So they enclosed this islet with the rings and bridge, which had a breadth of 100 feet, completely by a stone wall, building towers and gates on the bridges at either end of each passage for the sea water. The stone, black, white, and red, they quarried beneath the whole central islet in outer and inner rings, thus, by the same process, excavating a pair of interior basins for shipping with a roofing of native rock. Some of their buildings were of a single color. In other cases, they entertained themselves by intermingling the stones to produce a variegated surfaces of an inherently agreeable character. The whole circuit of the outermost wall they covered with a coat, a ceruse, as one might say, of copper, the inner with melted tin, and the wall of the actual Acropolis with Archaeological, which gleamed like fire. Within the Acropolis was the palace with the following design. In the very center, surrounded by a golden railing, which it was forbidden to enter, was an untrodden sanctuary sacred to Plato and Poseidon, the very place where the race of the 10 princesses had been first conceived and begotten. Here, too, the seasonable offerings were made yearly to each of them, from all the 10 lots. Poseidon himself had a temple, a furlong long and a half a furlong broad, with a proportionate height, but something un-Hellenistic in aspect. The whole exterior of this temple was coated with silver, except the figures on the pediments. These were covered with gold. Within the roof was throughout of ivory, ornamented with gold, silver, and orichalc, and all the rest, walls, columns, pavement, were covered with orichalc. It contained golden statues of the god standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, and on such a scale that his head touched the roof, and of 100 Nereids round him riding on dolphins, for that was then believed to be the number of the Nereids. It also contained many other statues dedicated by private persons. Outside the temple there stood golden statues of the wives of those who had been of the number of the 10 kings and of themselves, and many other great statues dedicated by kings and private persons of the country itself and the foreign nations over whom they were suzerain. There was an altar of size and workmanship to match the edifice. The palace, too, was no less worthy of the grandeur of the empire and the magnificence of its temples. Uses were found for the waters of the 2 springs, the cold and the warm. The supply from both was copious, and the natural flavor and virtues of their waters remarkable. So they were surrounded by buildings and plantations of appropriate trees, as well as with a number of basins, some open to the air, and others, which were used as warm baths in winter, covered. Of these there were several sets for the kings, for private citizens, and for women, and yet others for horses and other beasts of burden, each set with its own appropriate equipment. The waste from them was conducted to the grove of Poseidon, where the trees were of every kind, and thanks to the excellence of the soil, of incredible size and beauty, and then led into the outer rings of water by conduit at the bridges. Here, besides numerous temples of different gods, they had constructed a variety of gardens and gymnasia. Some of the last were for men. There were others on each of the 2 islands formed by the rings, especially for horses. In particular, they had a space reserved as a race course in the center of the larger of these islands. Its breadth was a furlong, and the whole length of the circumference was left free for the contests. Round this race course on both sides were barracks for the main body of the bodyguards. A number of the more trusty were stationed in the smaller ring near the citadel. To the most eminently trustworthy of all, the quarters were assigned within the citadel about the persons of the kings. The dockyards were filled with triremes and their appropriate equipments, all in excellent order. So much, then, for the appointments of the royal residence. When one had passed the 3 outer harbors, a wall ran all around, starting at the sea, at a uniform distance of 50 furlongs from the greatest ring and its harbor, returning on itself at the mouth of the canal from the sea. This wall was completely filled by a multitude of closely set houses, and the large harbor and canal were constantly crowded by merchant vessels and their passengers arriving from all quarters, whose vast numbers occasioned incessant shouting, clamoring, and general uproar day and night. I have now given you a pretty faithful report of what I once learned of the town and the old palace, and must do my best to recall the general character of the territory and its organization. To begin with, the district as a whole, so I have heard, was of great elevation and its coast precipitous, but all round the city was a plain enclosing it, and itself enclosed in turn by mountain ranges, which came right down to the sea. The plain itself was smooth, level, and of generally oblong shape. It stretched for 3,000 furlongs in one direction, and at its center for 2,000 inland from the coast. All through the island this level district faced the south, and was thus screened from the cold northerly winds. In those times it was famous for its encircling mountains, which were more numerous, huge, and beautiful than any that existed today. These mountains contain numerous villages with a wealthy population, besides rivers, lakes, and meadows, which provided plentiful sustenance for all sorts of animals, wild or domestic, and timber of different kinds in quantities amply sufficient for manufacturers of every type. Well, this plain, in consequence partly of its original structure, partly of the long-continued exertions of a succession of kings, had assumed an aspect which I shall now describe. From the first, it was naturally quadrangular, oblong, and nearly rectangular. Departures from that shape had been corrected by the carrying of fosse around it. As to the depth, breadth, and length of this fosse, it sounds incredible that any work of human hands should be so vast by comparison with other achievements of the kind. But I have to tell the tale as I heard it. It had been dug to the depth of 100 feet, had everywhere a furlong in breadth, and, as it was carried completely round the plain, its length came to 10,000 furlongs. It received the watercourses which came down from the mountains, made the tour of the plain, meeting the city in both directions, and was thence allowed to discharge into the sea. Beyond the city, straight canals of some 100 feet in width terminated once more at the fosse on the seaside, were drawn across the plain with a distance of 100 furlongs between every two. They were used for the floating of timber down to the town from the mountains and the conveyance by boat of natural produce generally, oblique channels of cross-communication being cut from these canals to one another and the city. There were actually 2 harvests in the year. In the winter, the husbandmen trusted to the sky for the irrigation. In the summer, they looked to the earth and released the waters of the canals. As to their numbers, each allotment of land was under an injunction to furnish 1 leader of a military detachment. The area of allotment was 10 furlongs by 10, and the total number of these allotments amounted to 60,000. The number of units supplied by the mountains and the territory at large was said to be enormous, and all were regularly assigned to the different allotments and leaders according to their district or villages. Each leader was then enjoined to furnish the army with the following contribution: 1/6 part of a war chariot, up to the full complement of 10,000 such chariots, 2 chargers with their riders, a pair of horses without car but supplied with a dragoon with light shield and driver for the pair, to stand behind the combatment, 2 hoplites, a pair of archers, and the same number of slingers, 3 light-armed throwers of stones, and the same number of javelin men, 4 marines, up to the full complement of 1,200 vessels. This was the war equipment of the royal city. In the other 9, there were various arrangements which would take much time to describe. The distribution of power and prerogative was, and had from the first, been this. Each of the 10 kings was, in his own territory and government, supreme over persons and, for the most part, over the laws, and could chastise and put to death at his pleasure. But their authority over and intercourse with one another was regulated by the commands of Poseidon, as they were informed by the law and by an inscription left by the earliest kings on a column of orichalc preserved in the sanctuary of Poseidon in the center of the island. Here, in fact, they were accustomed to assemble at alternate intervals of 4 and 5 years, thus showing equal respect for even number and odd. In these sessions they deliberated on their common affairs, made inquiry whether any of them were transgressing by law, and pronounced judgment. When they were to give judgment, they first exchanged pledges in this fashion. In the sanctuary of Poseidon, consecrated bulls roamed at large, an oath calling down grievous curses on the disobedient. So when they had offered sacrifice after their own ritual and were devoting all the bull's members, they would mingle a bowl of wine, casting in 1 lot of the blood for each man. The rest of the blood they cast into the fire, first cleansing the column. Then they drew the wine from the bowl in the golden beakers, made a libation over the fire, and swore an oath that they would give judgment according to the laws upon the column, would chastise any who had heretofore transgressed and hereafter transgress none of these ordinances wittingly, neither giving nor obeying commandment, save according to the laws of their father. When each had taken this vow for himself and his house after him, he drank and dedicated his beaker in the god's sanctuary, and so betook himself to the banquet and necessary business. When dark fell and the fire of the offerings was blue, and seated themselves so by the embers of their sacrifice on the bare earth, and by night quenching all fire in the sanctuary. Thus they gave and received judgment. If any charge any with transgression. Judgment given, when the morning came, they wrote the judgments on a plate of gold and dedicated it and their robes for a memorial. Now there were many more special laws concerning the rights of the several kings, but the chief of these were that they should bear no arm one against another, and that if any should essay to overthrow the royal house of any city, all should come to its help, but ever in accord with the rule of their ancestors. They should take counsel in common for war and all other affairs, and the chief command should be given to the house of Atlas. Also the king should have no power over the life of any of his kinsmen, save with the approval of more than half of the 10. Now this mighty and wondrous power, which then was in the region, the god arrayed and brought against this our own region. The cause, as the tale goes, being this: for many generations, while the gods' strain in them was still vigorous, they gave obedience to the laws and affection to the divine whereto they were a king. They were indeed true-hearted and great-hearted, bearing themselves to one another and to their various fortunes with judgment and humbleness. They thought scorn of all things save virtue, and counted their present prosperity a little thing. So they found the weight of their gold and other possessions a light load. Wealth made them not drunken with wantonness. Their mastery of themselves was not lost, nor their steps made uncertain. They perceived with the clear vision of the sober that even these things all receive increase from virtue and mutual love, whereas where the first are sought and held in honor, they decay themselves and the others perish with them. So by reason of such thoughts and the divine strain that persisted in them, their wealth in the things of which we have told was still further increased. But when the gods' part in them began to wax faint by constant crossing with much mortality, and the human temper to predominate, then they could no longer carry their fortunes, but began to behave themselves unseemingly. To the seeing eye they now began to seem foul, for they were losing the fairest bloom from their most precious treasure. But to such as could not see the true happy life, to appear at last fair and blessed indeed, now that they were taking the infection of wicked covet and pride of power. Zeus, the god of gods, who governs his kingdom by law, having the eye by which such things are seen, beheld their goodly house in its grievous plight, and was minded to lay a judgment on them, that the discipline might bring them back to tune. So he gathered all the gods in his most honorable residence, even that stands at the world's center and overlooks all that has part in becoming. And when he had gathered them there, he said, and here the rest of the Discourse of Critias has been lost. End of the Discourse of Critias. Appendix: The Story of Atlantis. It is as certain as such a thing can be that the whole story of Atlantis, including the statement that Solon had met with tales about the island in Egypt, is one of Plato's imaginative fictions. Though Proclus tells us that Crantor, who was a member of the Academy about 300 BC, took the narrative as history, Strabo the geographer, who disbelieves the story himself, relates that it was credited by the famous Stoic polymath of the 1st century BC, Posidonius. Even Pliny is skeptical. At a later date, Ammianus Marcellinus, the historian and friend of the Emperor Julian, is a believer. The great critic of the 3rd century AD, Longinus, regarded the whole narrative as a fanciful literary ornament. Many of the Neoplatonists treated it as allegory, though they were not agreed about its interpretations. The less critical among them, Iamblichus, Cyrenius, and others, took it for history, and Proclus thinks it due to Plato's character for veracity to hold that view. The early Byzantine geographer Cosmas Indioklapistus tries to fit Atlantis into his scheme of cosmography based on scripture. The Middle Ages are said to show no interest in the matter, but the belief was revived in Renaissance times, partly by the rekindling of the devotion to Plato, partly by the discovery of America. Though the soundest scholars and geographers were mostly incredulous, Bacon speaks in his own New Atlantis as though he admitted the former existence of the island, while regarding everything else as Plato's invention. But one cannot be sure how far he is in earnest. Even Stahlbaum, in the introduction to his edition of the Critias of 1838, suggests that Plato may have heard in Egypt some vague report of the existence of America. From the 16th to the 18th century, attempts were made to find traces of the lost island in many quarters: America, Ireland, Azores, even Australia and New Zealand. On all these wild speculations, much information will be found in the dissertation on the subject, which forms a note in T.H. Martin's edition of the Timaeus. The narrative of the foundation of the Atlantic kingdom was sometimes supposed to be a distorted echo of the biblical traditions of the antediluvians. The learned Swede Olaus Rudbeck, on the contrary, found the city described in the Critias in Uppsala, and made the discovery part of his theory that Scandinavia was the original home of all the peoples of Europe and Asia. Finally, in the late 18th century, the unfortunate savant J.S. Bailey, in his Letters sur d'origine du sciences and Lettres sur Atlantide, 1779, identified Atlantis with Spitzbergen, which he made the original home of an extinct race who conquered Asia and invented all arts and sciences. This last point is altogether foreign to Plato. His Atlantids, who were all swallowed by the sea in a day and night, could clearly not be imagined to be the originators of the still existing sciences. Fancies of this kind have long disappeared from serious history and ethnology, though they still seem to have a curious fascination for the imperfectly educated. No competent historian now doubts that the sciences of the Mediterranean peoples were an indigenous development, started by observational knowledge picked up through contact with Egypt and Babylon. It is certain that neither Solon nor Plato could have learned anything in Egypt about the remote prehistory of Athens, and our increasing acquaintance with Egyptian records has done nothing to make it credible that the Egyptians had any cognizance of the existence of America. Where Plato really got the materials for his history, the story itself will tell us, if we read it with attention. We still see in the Critias the train of reasoning by which he arrived at his conception of the physical geography of prehistoric Attica, to endow its inhabitants with the characteristics institutions of the early books of the Republic is, as he as good as tells us, a stroke of his own imagination. The marvelous wealth and engineering skill with which he credits their antagonists are demanded for the moral of his story, and the details given of the great hydraulic works of their monarchs and the incredible fertility of their territory are, as Mr. Freelander has observed, strikingly reminiscent of Babylon and the Babylonian plain, of which Plato would get knowledge from Herodotus, Xenophon, and Ctesias. To make the invaders come from the west is an idea probably suggested by the fact that the hosts of Xerxes, who are, no doubt in Plato's mind, came from the opposite quarter. To put their capital on an island is natural to a thinker who held, as Plato does in the Laws, that the possession of naval superiority is a dangerous temptation to ungodly lust of domination. Add a sailor's tale or two, coming in the end probably from Carthaginian seamen, of the existence of islands in the North Atlantic and of the state of the seas west of the Straits of Gibraltar, and we have all the materials for the account of Atlantis. Since the island does not exist now, it has to be removed by a catastrophe, and the peculiar character of this catastrophe, the combination of an earthquake and a great tidal wave, would be readily suggested by the fact that in Plato's own Middle Age, the coast of Achaia was visited by precisely such a disaster, of which interesting notices have been preserved by Aristotle in his Meteorologica and Pausanias. I have already, in a note to the translation of the Critias, given reasons for holding that even the statement that the tale was told by Solon by the Egyptian priests is a part of the fiction. Would it be possible that it was actually heard in Egypt, not by Solon, but by Plato himself? I think not. I can believe that a bragging Egyptian priest might tell an Athenian traveler strange tales about wholly unknown or imaginary lands, but hardly that he would pretend to be able to give him information about the early history of Attica. It would be irrelevant to connect the story of Atlantis with the teachings of modern geology about the distributions of land and water in immensely remote times. We are told that in the Tertiary period there was a land bridge across the North Atlantic, as there were several across the Mediterranean. But it is, of course, obvious that Plato could know nothing about this. The general conception underlying Plato's Timaeus is that the seas known to the Greeks all open into one great ocean, which is in its turn ringed round by a land which is, to us, terra incognita. The source of this representation is simply the old Homeric belief in the river Oceanus, which girdles our known earth. End of Translator's Appendix. And also this is the end of the reading of the Discourse of Plato's Critias. Please do hit that like button, share it with your friends, leave me a comment, and subscribe to the channel.